The room had fallen into a particular kind of silence, the kind that belongs to men who believe they have already won. 12 chairs arranged around a long mahogany table. 4 solicitors, 2 of them employed by Mr. Gerard Pooley, 1 by the county magistrate's office, and 1, visibly younger and considerably less confident than the rest, retained by the Viscount Ashmore. A pair of witnesses in good coats who had been well paid not to remember too clearly. The magistrate himself, Sir Walter Bryce, a careful man with the unhappy expression of someone required by his office to preside over a thing he privately doubted. And at the near end of the table, standing where she had not been expected to stand, a young woman in a plain gray dress, with her hands folded at her waist and her face entirely composed. Her name was Cecily Vane. To every man in that room except one, she was nothing more than a pauper's daughter who had arrived at an inconvenient moment. Mr. Pooley, who occupied the chair nearest the fire, wore the expression of a man choosing between contempt and amusement. He had not yet decided which. He was a large man, well-fed, with the kind of social confidence that comes from never having been wrong in a room that mattered. He had been wrong before, in smaller rooms, and had covered it neatly. This room, he had calculated, was not that kind. Nicholas Ashmore, Viscount Ashmore, stood at the far end of the table. He had not sat down since Cecily entered. He stood with his hands behind his back, watching her with an expression that revealed nothing, and contained, had anyone been trained to read it, a very great deal. Cecily looked at the forged document spread flat in the center of the table. She looked at Sir Walter Bryce. She said, in a voice that was clear and level and gave nothing away, that she wished to speak. Mr. Pooley's solicitor began to object. Sir Walter raised one hand. "You are the daughter of the late Reverend Edmund Vane," Sir Walter said. "I am," Cecily said. "And you claim to have been present at Ashmore Park on the 14th of September, 6 years past, when the late Viscount's will was recorded by his solicitor." "I do not claim it," Cecily said. "I was there." The room made a sound, not quite laughter, not quite dismissal, but something in the space between them. She did not flinch. She drew a breath. She began. The words that came from her were not summary. They were not approximation. They were the will itself, clause by clause, in the precise legal language in which it had been dictated by an old man in a high-backed chair beside a library fire, while her father stood at the window, and she sat very still in the corner with her hands in her lap, and her memory doing what her memory had always done, holding every word as though it were a thing with weight, a stone she could carry indefinitely without setting down. She recited the opening declaration, the naming of the testator, the date, the sound mind and disposing memory. She recited the first clause, which concerned the disposition of the entailed estate and the primary inheritance. She recited the specific sum, £4,000, allocated for the education and maintenance of Thomas Charles Ashmore, minor, the orphaned son of the late Henry Ashmore. She recited the dower arrangement as written, precise in its figures and its terms. She recited the bequest to the church at Westhaven. She did not stop when Pooley said her name sharply. She did not stop when his solicitor rose half out of his chair. She stopped only when she had spoken every word, and the room received them in a silence it had not chosen and could not fill. She had been in Bath for 2 years before the letter arrived. Her father had died in the March of the previous year, leaving behind him a rented house, a modest library that had to be sold, £3 in a tin box on the mantelpiece, and a reputation for quiet goodness that was worth nothing at all in the arithmetic of survival. Cecily had been her father's reader, his copyist, his memory when his own began to falter. She had kept his correspondence, organized his sermons, and manage the household on what he brought in from occasional parish work and the charity of the 2 or 3 families who had known him when he was young and prosperous and had not yet lost everything by degrees. She found her position with Mrs. Hargrove, a widow in Bath, with a small income and a large appetite for being read to, through the mediation of a mutual acquaintance. It was not a governess position, though Cecily had the education for it. It was not a companion position in the precise social sense, though she accompanied Mrs. Hargrove to concerts and lending libraries and sat with her in the evenings. It was the kind of position that had no official name, which meant it carried no official dignity, which meant that the people who encountered Cecily in Mrs. Hargrove's drawing room were never entirely certain how to address her, or whether to address her at all. She did not resent them for it. She understood the machinery. She had grown up on the tolerant edge of it. The letter from Ashmore Park arrived in April. It was written by Mr. Croft, the estate steward, who had been recommended to write it by a former colleague of her father's in the parish network, who had mentioned in passing that the Reverend Vane's daughter had a head for books and Latin marginalia. The late Viscount's library had not been properly catalogued in a decade. The new Viscount wished it done. The position offered a modest fee and a room in the East Wing and the use of the library from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. It would take perhaps 2 months. Cecily sat with the letter for a long time before she answered it. She knew the name Ashmore. She had been there once, in the autumn of her 18th year, when her father had been called to witness a legal document at the request of the old Viscount, who trusted him. The old Viscount had been kind, in the distracted way of men who are too ill to maintain the careful distances of rank. He had asked her to sit down. He had not sent her from the room when the solicitor arrived. She had sat in her corner and listened and remembered, the way she always did, without meaning to, without effort, without knowing at the time that the words settling into the architecture of her memory would ever be required to carry weight. She knew that the will was disputed. Everyone in Bath who read the news sheets knew it. She accepted the position because she needed the income, and because, if she was honest with herself about the thing she was not yet ready to be honest about, she wanted to know what had become of the old Viscount's son. The park at Ashmore was larger than she remembered, or perhaps she had been too young to take it in properly. The stone of the house was a dark gray that went silver in certain lights, and the windows of the east wing threw long rectangles of early morning brightness across the gravel when she arrived. Mr. Croft met her at the side entrance, a capable man in his 50s, who looked at her with the assessing courtesy of someone who has been tasked with something unusual and is reserving judgment until he sees how it goes. Lord Ashmore received her in the study on her second morning. He stood when she entered, which she had not expected, and did not sit until she did, which she also had not expected. And then he looked at her for a moment without speaking, which she had expected entirely. He was taller than she had supposed from the descriptions she had absorbed through the news sheets and the conversations of Bath drawing rooms. His face was composed with the specific discipline of someone who has trained himself not to react, and the training showed most clearly in moments of stillness, when the effort of it was perceptible in the set of his jaw and the controlled evenness of his breathing. He asked her whether she had reviewed the library's existing catalogue. He asked whether she was comfortable with the room assigned to her. He told her, in 4 short sentences, what he expected, and thanked her for coming, and said that Mr. Croft would answer any questions she had, and then he turned back to the papers on his desk. That evening, in the drawing room before dinner, she was introduced to the Dowager Lady Ashmore. Nicholas's stepmother was a woman of 50-something, who wore her diamonds the way generals wear their medals, deliberately and with the full awareness of what they signify. She was polite to Cecily in the particular way that politeness is used as a border wall. She mentioned, twice, the temporary nature of the cataloging position. After dinner, when Cecily had gone upstairs, she heard voices in the hallway, and through the partly closed door she caught Lady Ashmore's voice carrying the words to Mr. Pooley, who had arrived that afternoon and was staying the week. "What can a pauper's daughter tell us that matters?" Pooley's answer was a short, pleased sound. A laugh barely troubled to be one. The library was long and cold in the mornings, and warm by noon. Cecily began at the south wall, working methodically through the shelves, noting in her catalogue the title, the author, the condition, the language. The work suited the part of her mind that liked order, and it left the other part free to move, which was how she had always done her best thinking. On the fourth day, she found Thomas. He was 8 years old and small for it, and he was under the reading table at the far end of the room, not hiding exactly, but not hiding either, which is a different thing. She heard the sound he was not quite making, that particular controlled quietness that children adopt when they have been crying, for long enough that the crying has gone internal. She did not pretend not to have heard it. She crossed the room without hurrying and crouched down until she could see him. And she said, in the same voice she used for Mrs. Hargrove at 2 a.m, "There is room under here for 2 people, if neither of us minds the dust." He looked at her. He had his uncle's eyes, or what his uncle's eyes might have been at 8, before the discipline. She sat down on the floor beside the reading table, her back against the shelf behind it, and she told him the names of the stars she knew, starting with the ones she had learned from her father, and working outward to the ones she had found in books. She did not tell them as facts. She told them as if each one were a small country she had visited and found interesting, and she described what she had found there, speaking about Orion the way a person speaks about a neighbor who has certain habits worth knowing, and about the Pleiades the way you speak about a family with a complicated history and a beautiful house. She told him which stars the sailors used for navigation, and which ones the old Greeks had told stories about, and which ones her father used to find on winter evenings from their garden, calling them by their proper Latin names in a voice that made even Latin sound warm. Thomas listened with the focused attention of a child who has found an unexpected harbor. By the time she reached Cassiopeia, he had crawled out from under the table and was sitting beside her with his arms around his knees. By the time she reached the last star she knew by name, he was leaning against her shoulder with his eyes half closed. She did not see the figure in the doorway. Lord Ashmore stood there for a long time. He did not make a sound. He watched a woman he had hired to catalog his library sit on the floor of that library in the cold of the late afternoon and speak softly about stars to a child who had been told he would be sent away, and something in his face shifted, barely, like a change in the light that has nothing to do with the lamps. He went away again without speaking. He came to the library the following morning on the pretext of retrieving a letter he had left on the desk. He had left no letter on the desk. Cecily was working at the south wall and did not look up immediately when he entered, and so she did not see him pause in the middle of the room and stand for a moment longer than the errand required. He asked her, when she did look up, whether she remembered her father's various parish visits, the visiting of houses and estates in his capacity as witness. She said she had accompanied him often. He asked if she had accompanied him to Ashmore Park. His voice, she noted, was level. It was a careful question wearing the clothes of a casual one. She said she had come once, yes. He did not ask when. She did not say when. He set down some papers on the desk that he appeared to have decided he had brought after all, and he told her, without looking at her, that a man from Mr. Pooley's household had been seen at the south gate that morning. If anyone approached her about the contents of the library or the late Viscount's papers, she was to refer them to Mr. Croft and come to him directly. He said this in the tone of a command, and she heard, underneath it, the thing it actually was. The man from Pooley's household arrived the following afternoon, while Cecily was at the east shelves working through a set of estate maps. He presented himself as a secretary, a young man in a good coat with a pleasantly arranged face, and the kind of manner that could pass for courtesy in rooms where no one was paying close attention. He said he was conducting inquiries on behalf of his employer into the late Viscount's personal papers and legal correspondence. He wondered if she had found anything of that nature in her cataloging work. He said it in a tone that suggested the question was routine, and the answer would be freely given. Cecily set down her pencil. She looked at him for a moment with the composed attention of someone who is deciding very little while appearing to decide nothing at all. She said that any questions about the library's contents should be directed to Mr. Croft, the estate steward, whom she would be happy to send for if he wished to wait. The young man said that would not be necessary. He thanked her and left with the air of someone who has received exactly what he expected, which was not what she had given him. She went directly to the study and told Nicholas. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, standing very still at the window with the afternoon light behind him, that she had done correctly. He said it in 4 words, and she heard them land, and felt, in the way that certain short sentences are felt rather than processed, that he had not been certain she would come to him. When he had gone, she stood very still for a moment. Her pulse was doing something she did not instruct it to do, and her hand, which she had placed on the shelf beside her, pressed against the spine of a quarto volume she could not have named. She was aware, with the specific precision of a person trying to be unaware, of exactly where he had been standing, 3 paces from the desk, and the sound his footstep had made on the bare boards when he turned to leave. She had known about the wound before she came to Ashmore. Bath was a city of circulating information, and the story of the late Viscount's death had been well circulated. His son abroad, the journey not completed in time, the old man gone before Nicholas arrived. What the news sheets had not known, and what Cecily had not known until the afternoon, she opened the library's locked correspondence drawer, searching for a catalogue entry, and found, behind a sheaf of estate receipts, an envelope addressed in a shaking hand to Lord Ashmore, still sealed. She did not open it. She replaced it. She left it where it was. It was Mr. Croft who mentioned, without meaning to, that his lordship had never collected the last of his father's papers from the drawer, that there was a letter in there, that Mr. Croft had mentioned it twice and been told, both times, to leave it alone. She understood then the shape of what he carried. Not guilt precisely, though it wore guilt's clothes, a sentence that had never been finished, a conversation he had imagined going one way, which had gone another, which had then gone silent before he could correct the imagining. The investment venture he had gone to resolve had been failing for 2 years before he left. The estate depended on its resolution. He had done what his father asked, and while he was doing it, his father had died. And the only things remaining to him were the knowledge that his father had needed him elsewhere, and the sealed envelope that might or might not speak to whether his father had understood. That was the thing about sealed envelopes. They held both possibilities with equal patience, and the one who could not bear to look lived suspended between them indefinitely. She had known that silence. She had sat with her own father for years before he died, reading to him in the evenings, and she had sometimes thought, doing this now, so that I will have done it. So there is no sentence left unfinished between us. She had the advantage of having known what she was doing. Nicholas had not known. He had gone abroad for the estate's sake, and his father had died before he could return. and he had come home to a sealed envelope he could not open, because whatever was inside it might confirm the thing he feared, that his father had died believing himself left behind. He opened it. She heard later from Mr. Croft, on the evening of the dinner at which Mr. Pooley had made the remark that had settled into Cecily's chest like a stone. The dinner had been unpleasant in the particular way of formal meals at which the battle being fought is not acknowledged to be a battle. Pooley had arrived with his solicitor and a woman identified as his particular friend, a Miss Farrer, who wore ice-blue silk and assessed Cecily across the table with the frank curiosity of someone examining a piece of furniture. The conversation had touched on the estate, on the legal proceedings due to begin in a fortnight, on the unfortunate uncertainty of the matter. Pooley had said, addressing no one in particular and the assembled table in general, that it was a sad thing when a man of good standing had his inheritance clouded by the testimony of persons of doubtful reliability. He had looked at Cecily when he said it. He said, his voice carrying the pleasant ease of a man who expects no contradiction, "We are expected to give weight to a pauper's daughter's recollections over the clear instrument of a legal will?" Lady Ashmore had not corrected him. Nicholas had not spoken. The solicitor had smiled at his plate. Cecily had set down her fork with the precise care of a woman who has learned to make her hands do what her face will not. It was 2 days later, in the corridor outside the study, that she overheard Hadwick. Mr. Hadwick was the junior solicitor who had been employed by the late Viscount's office. A narrow man with the voice of someone who has practiced sounding more confident than he is. He was speaking to someone she could not see, and what he said was, "His lordship's case rests on a pauper's daughter. The court will laugh them out before luncheon." She stood in the corridor and did not move. She let the words settle where they settled. Then she went back to the library and stood at the window and looked out at the park, at the bare branches of the oaks and the long shadow of the south wall across the frost-stiffened ground, and she thought very carefully about what she knew and what she could do with it, and what it would cost her, and what it would cost other people if she did nothing. She had been considering the question in one form or another since the afternoon she arrived at Ashmore Park and understood the full shape of what was being contested. She had turned it the way she turned any difficult thing, slowly, looking at each face of it before moving to the next. There was the question of what a court would make of her. A woman in a gray dress with no income and no standing, claiming to remember a legal document from 6 years ago. There was the question of what memory itself was, as evidence, whether the law had any category for it, whether the magistrate was a man who would listen to what he could not verify and let the verification come from somewhere else. There was the question of Thomas asleep upstairs and the £4,000 with his name written on it in a will that had been removed from a solicitor's file by a man who had calculated that no one would remember well enough to contradict him. He had calculated wrong. She took from her coat pocket her father's testament. It was small and worn at the corners, bound in dark red morocco that had gone soft with years of handling. Her father had carried it always. When he died, it had been in his coat, and she had taken it from the coat pocket with her own hands and put it in her own. And it had lived there since. And it was the only thing of his she had kept when everything else was sold. She opened it to the flyleaf. There, in her father's careful hand, was a note he had made the morning of their journey to Ashmore Park, 6 years before. He had the habit of marking his travels on the flyleaf of whatever he carried, the date, the place, the occasion. September the 14th, Ashmore Park. Witness to the last testament of George Henry Ashmore, Viscount Ashmore. And beneath it, in a slightly smaller hand, Cecily with me. She had always read that as tenderness. She read it now as evidence. Nicholas had told her, that afternoon, that she should leave before the hearing. He had come to the library and stood in the doorway and said it without preamble, and his voice was level, but there was something in it that she had not heard before. Something worn at the edges, and she had understood that he was not dismissing her. He was protecting her from a thing he believed was coming, a public embarrassment, a scene in which she would be the object of men's contempt. He had said, "Go back to Bath, Miss Vane." He had said, "I am grateful for your work here." He had said, "There is nothing to be done." She had looked at him for a long time. She had said, "I know the will, my lord." He had gone very still. "I was in this room," she said, "when your father dictated it. I was 18, and I sat in that corner, and no one told me to leave, and I heard every word. I have heard every word since. It does not leave me." He stood in the doorway and did not speak. "I can say it," she said. "All of it. In the correct order. In the correct legal form." He said, finally, his voice very low, "Cecily." It was the first time he had used her given name. It was not a command, and it was not a question. It was the sound of a man's certainty rearranging itself around a fact he had not known to account for. The hearing room was in the east wing of Ashmore Park, a long room with a fire at one end and windows at the other, and the particular cold that legal proceedings seem to generate regardless of how many logs are burning. Sir Walter arrived at 9 in the morning. The solicitors arrived at 1:15. Pooley arrived at 1:30 with his 2 men and his air of comfortable finality, and took his chair near the fire and laid his hands flat on the table as a man lays cards. The forged will was produced. Hadwick presented it with the professional ease of a man who has rehearsed the gesture until it no longer looks rehearsed. It was a credible document, and Cecily could see from where she stood, just inside the door, that it was credible precisely because someone had gone to considerable trouble with the paper and the phrasing, had known enough of the form to avoid the obvious errors, had understood that legal language is its own kind of armor. The witnesses who had signed it sat in chairs along the wall with the careful blankness of men who have been paid to have poor memories. When she stepped forward and asked to speak, the room's attention shifted the way rooms do when something unexpected enters them. Not the thing that was expected happening sooner or differently, but an entirely different thing arriving through a door no one had thought to watch. Pooley's solicitor, a man called Turnby, objected that she was not a party to the proceedings. Sir Walter said she was free to speak. Pooley said, addressing the magistrate with the patient condescension of a man explaining the obvious to someone who has temporarily lost sight of it, "We are expected to accept the word of a pauper's daughter over a sworn legal instrument?" Sir Walter looked at Pooley. He looked at Cecily. He said, "Let her speak." She did not build to it. She did not preface it. She put her hands at her waist and she began. She gave the opening declaration as the solicitor had written it 6 years ago, in the formal cadence of a man who knew his Blackstone and took some pride in the fact, she gave the naming of the testator, the county, the date, the attestation of sound mind. She gave the first clause whole, the disposition of the entailed estate and the lands at Westhaven and the secondary property in Somerset, to Nicholas George Henry Ashmore, Viscount Ashmore, as principal heir. She gave the amount. She gave the conditions. She gave the clause concerning Thomas Charles Ashmore, orphaned minor, and the £4,000 set in trust for his education and establishment, managed by the estate solicitor until his majority. She gave the dower arrangement for the present Lady Ashmore, intact and clearly detailed, a specified annual income, and the use of the dower house at Elmfield for her lifetime. She gave the personal bequest to the church at Westhaven 100 guineas for the repair of the nave. She gave the clause that recorded the bequest to Gerard Pooley, nephew by marriage, the sum of £500 and good wishes, and nothing more. She paused for a moment after that clause. Not for effect. Because she had felt the room change. She gave the closing attestation, the signatures and their offices, the date reconfirmed, the sealing. Then she stopped. The room was entirely quiet. The fire crackled once and went back to its steady work. Outside the windows, the park was white with frost and very still. Pooley's face had gone through several registrations in rapid succession and had settled, for the moment, on a controlled blankness that was the face of a man recalculating. Turnby had not moved. Hadwick, at the far end of the table, was looking at the surface of the table with the focused attention of someone who has decided that looking up would be a mistake. Turnby said, after a moment, that the recitation of a document from memory was not the same as the document itself, that the court could not accept the testimony of an unsworn witness with no corroborating evidence, that this was a theatrical gesture and not a legal one. Cecily reached into her coat pocket and placed her father's testament on the table. She opened it to the flyleaf and turned it so that Sir Walter could read it. And he leaned forward. And he read it. She said, "My father served as witness to the will. His name appears in the document as I recited it. He inscribed this on the morning of their journey to Ashmore Park, as was his habit, his name and the date and the occasion." Sir Walter read it twice. "And you were present with him," he said. "I was. His handwriting says so." Turnby began another sentence. Pooley put a hand on his arm and Turnby stopped. Lord Ashmore said from the far end of the table, "Mrs. Pell?" The door opened. The old housekeeper, a woman in her 60s who had been at Ashmore Park for 40 years, came in with the deliberate step of someone who has made a decision and intends to keep it. She had not been summoned dramatically. She had been waiting, quietly, in the hall outside. Sir Walter asked her whether she recalled the 14th of September 6 years past. She said she did. The late Viscount had been well enough that week to have visitors. The Reverend Vane had come with his daughter. The young woman had sat in the library while the legal business was conducted. Sir Walter asked if she had any particular reason to recall the visit clearly. Mrs. Pell said that she had brought the young woman a cup of tea while she waited, and the young woman had thanked her by name, having been told it only once that morning by Mr. Croft. She had thought it a notable thing in a person so young, and she had thought, seeing the same young woman again these past weeks in the library, that she had not changed much in the interval, except that she was thinner, and had learned to keep her own counsel. The room absorbed this. Pooley had stopped calculating. His face had arrived at a destination that was not a comfortable one. Hadwick, who had been very still for some time, got up from his chair and moved toward the door. Mr. Ames, Nicholas's solicitor, who had recovered considerably in the past quarter hour, said, with a firmness he had not displayed earlier in the proceedings, that he requested Mr. Hadwick be asked to remain. Sir Walter requested it. Hadwick remained. The proceedings continued for another 2 hours, but the shape of them had changed entirely. What came out of those 2 hours, by degrees and under the patient pressure of Sir Walter's questions, was sufficient to warrant the matter being referred to higher authorities for investigation of the document's provenance. Hadwick had nothing useful to say for himself, and said it at length. Turnby ceased to object to anything. Pooley answered questions in the polished way of a man waiting to see which of his exits remained open, and finding, one by one, that they did not. Nicholas did not look at Cecily during those 2 hours. He looked at the table, and at Pooley, and once at Mrs. Pell with something in his face that was not quite gratitude, and was larger than gratitude. He looked the way a man looks when the thing he had given up has been returned to him, and the returning of it is still catching up with the rest of him. Before the proceedings adjourned, He stood at the far end of the table and looked the length of the room at Cecily, and what he said required no repetition and no amplification and no theater. He said, his voice even and clear as the flat surface of winter water, "She is the future Viscountess Ashmore. I think you will all sit down." Pooley sat down. The room sat down. Sir Walter permitted himself one brief expression that was not entirely the expression of a magistrate. Lady Ashmore had been sitting near the fire throughout, and her face had been doing quiet work, the work of revision. When it was over, and the room had begun to empty, she sat for a moment without moving, and then she rose and went out without speaking to anyone. Nicholas came to find her in the library that evening. He had spoken with Lady Ashmore for an hour before he came, and what he had said to her Cecily did not know precisely. But when she passed the study, she heard his voice, very level, speaking of dower arrangements, and she heard Lady Ashmore say, in a smaller voice than the one she customarily used, that she had not known. That Pooley had told her Nicholas intended to contest the dower terms, that she had not understood she was being used. Nicholas said he knew. He said she need not have feared. He came to the library, and he stood in the doorway, the way he had stood in it on the night he did not know she was aware he was watching. And she was at the south wall again, replacing a volume she had been looking at. And she turned, and he was there. He said, "Cecily." He had used her name twice before. The first time it had been surprised and rearranging. The second time it had been a question he could not ask directly. Now it was a name given on purpose, in full knowledge of what the giving cost and what he intended it to mean. She stood with her hands at her sides. He said, "I want to say something, and I am not confident I will say it correctly." She waited. He said that he had spent 2 years carrying a certainty that his father had died disappointed, and that he had been wrong. He said that the letter, which he had opened 3 nights past and read by a fire that was burning too low, had been his father's voice, straightforward and warm, saying the things his father had apparently always meant to say, and had not quite managed to say in person. He said that his father had written, "I have left the estate to you, as I always intended. Come home when you are able. I have no doubt of you." He said this in the same level voice he used for everything, but his hands, which were at his sides, were not quite still. She did not say anything for a moment. The fire behind her was steady, and the park outside the windows was dark, and the room smelled of old paper, and the particular cold that lives in libraries, even in winter. Then she said, "I am glad you opened it." He said, "I am glad you stayed." He crossed the room. He stopped when there was still a proper distance between them, the distance that meant something deliberate, that meant he was aware of what he was doing and was doing it without misunderstanding. He put out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, the way she had looked at her father's testament on the flyleaf, the way she looked at things she needed to be certain of, and then she put her hand in his. He did not move immediately. He held her hand with the careful steadiness of a man who has learned to be still, and they stood in the library with the fire behind them, and outside the windows the oaks stood in the last of the light, and the silence between them was not an empty one. Thomas was already asleep upstairs. She had told him, 3 hours before, that the estate was safe, and he would not be sent away. And he had received this information with the thoughtful silence of a child processing something too large for the available language. And then he had asked if she would be at Ashmore for his birthday, which was in April. She had said she thought so. He had asked if she would tell him more stars. She had said she would tell him all the ones she had not told him yet. He had nodded as if this settled a matter of importance, and gone to find his supper. Later, when the house had grown quiet and the last of the servants had retired and the park was dark in every direction, Cecily sat in the chair nearest the library fire with a book open on her lap that she was not reading. The fire had gone down a little, and the candles had burned to their last quarter-inch. And she was not reading because she was listening to the silence of the house, the way it breathed at this hour, the settling of the old stonework and the distant sound of something. A branch, perhaps, moving against a window somewhere above. She had sat in a great many silences in her life, and she had learned to read them as precisely as she read text. The silence of her father's study after he died was one kind. The silence of Mrs. Hargrove's rooms in Bath at 2 a.m. was another. This silence was different from either of them. This silence had a shape she recognized. The shape of a house that knows it will go on, that has been told it is safe and believed it, and is resting in that knowledge. She thought about her father, who had carried his testament with him everywhere, and marked the flyleaf with the record of his days, and had written, on one morning 6 years ago, in his careful hand, that his daughter had come with him. She thought he had meant it simply, as he meant everything simply. But there was nothing simple about the fact of it now. Nothing simple about the way the small inscription had carried forward through time and arrived here, in this room, to say what it needed to say. There was a shelf to her right, one she had catalogued in the second week and had arranged with some care, and on it she had placed her father's testament that afternoon, not in her pocket anymore, but standing upright between a volume of sermons and a collection of English verse, its dark red cover soft against the leather spines on either side. She had set it there with the deliberate feeling of a person placing something in the right place. Finally, after carrying it a long way, the fire shifted and settled. The room held them. Outside, the first stars appeared over the oaks, and they were the ones she knew by name. If this story moved you, leave a word below, and we will meet again when the next one is ready to be told. Thank you for staying until the end.